Hey everybody, and welcome back to DJ Tutorials. Today we are going to be talking about condensation that you can add onto glass or a beverage product or anything like that. So basically what you will have is something that looks kind of like this by the end, hopefully. And I will show you basically the project file that I have on my Gumroad. So I'm just going to turn on the rendered view here. And basically what we have is a very simple setup here. And I have a water glass that has the condensation already created on the actual glass itself and the particles that we're going to be creating for the glass. And it has some really cool materials, some really nice lighting, and a nice backdrop here. So if you would like to get the project file, you can go onto the Gumroad. It's going to be linked down below in the video description. And I will be basically showing you how to make something that looks kind of like this. So at this point in your project, you should have something that looks like this. If you want me to do a tutorial on how to create this nice looking glass and the water and also the ice that's in here, I can do that. Just let me know in the comments if you would like me to do that. And depending on how many comments I get and requests, I can do this tutorial for this really cool glass here. But I'm just going to do a really quick, just sort of like demo and show you kind of like what I did, okay? So I'm going to turn off the glass and the water, and basically what these ice cubes are, if I isolate this, you can see that it's basically just a sort of like trapezoidal three-dimensional shape here, and I added some roughness with an image map and basically made it look a little bit frosty like a ice cube. And basically after that I just duplicated a few times and put it inside the glass manually. I didn't do anything super fancy, so that's pretty simple to do. You should be able to handle that just fine. The next thing I did here is I made a glass, and if we look at it from a view like this in wireframe here, you can see that I added some space down here with some really nice looking geometry so that you get that really cool effect that looks like this in the bottom. And there's some rings also on the bottom, which helps to make this really cool look down here. And then at the top, I made sure to add a little lip because the water glasses I have this really neat little lip, and I think it looks pretty neat. And you can see that even though it's a little bit strong, there are some, let's just turn off the overlays here. You can see that there are some scratches and stuff like that. It's a little bit deep right now, but that's fine. It looks pretty cool. And then for the water here, basically you just duplicate the inside portion of your glass. So you just duplicate sort of like the inside parts. And then what I did was you need to make sure that the geometry plays just inside of the glass. I'll kind of show you what happens if it's not playing on the inside. By inside, I mean it needs to bisect your actual geometry of your glass. If you make it go like this, you can kind of see that the water doesn't look quite right. It's just sort of sitting inside. So it has to sort of like, if I go inside here and you look at the wireframe, the geometry has to be actually inside the mesh of your glass. So make sure that you do that when you create the water. And after I sort of like created a general shaping of that, I turned on my ice and I added what's called a multi-res modifier. You can see that right there. Went into sculpting, and I just basically made it look a little bit uneven on the surface so that it looks like there's some play in the water in some of the edges and stuff like that, so it's not 100% perfect, so that it just kind of looks a little bit uneven. There's a little bit of the water sort of like connecting to the ice here. I added a simple floor here in the sample project file I showed you at the beginning of the project. There's more stuff going on, but this is a very basic sort of like project file for you to understand what's going on. And I went up here and I just turned off the scene world so I can use the pre-built HDRIs inside of Blender, so you can just have that at your disposal. So if you fast forward to this section here, I just got done explaining how I generally created all this stuff without a step-by-step process. So again, if you want me to show you how to make all of this stuff, I can create some tutorials, but that's going to be based on the comments I get below. So let me know if you'd like that, and I can create this for you guys. All right, so let's add this condensation effect. So the first thing that we basically need to do is create some kind of roughness that goes from the area that should be cold to the area that should be warm or no condensation. There shouldn't really be condensation on the top. It should be basically from where the actual liquid is and the coldness is inside the glass. So, what we need to do here is we need to have a controlling effect on the roughness that we add to the surface. And this is just the first layer of condensation. We're going to be doing sort of like a general roughness to sort of simulate some of the condensation effect, and then we're going to be doing a water droplet effect over the top. Now, there's a number of ways to control where things are on your object. You can UV unwrap it and paint it. You can do all sorts of things, but we're going to use a procedural gradient texture to create this effect. So the first thing that we need to do here, and I am using Node Wrangler, so if you want to use it, go to Edit Preferences, go into Add-ons, search for Node Wrangler, and make sure that that's checked on. And I'm not going to be talking too much about all of my key presses and stuff like that because this is really something that's more advanced and you should kind of have a good idea about the navigation inside the program anyway. So inside of the shader editor here, we're going to add a texture and it's going to be this gradient texture right here. And we can put it just like that. And let's zoom in on this section. Now, what we want to do is we want to control the vector of this and how this is being applied to our object. So what we're going to do here is clicking on this, I'm going to hit Control T, which is going to add a mapping node and a texture coordinate. You don't need to have Node Wrangler installed to do this. You can just add those from this menu. But basically, you want to have these here, and we're going to change the input here to object. And we're going to Control Shift left click, which is going to view through with this viewer node here with Node Wrangler enabled. We're going to view just through that so we can see what's going on with it. And basically what we need to do is we need to use or control this gradient to sort of go in this other direction. It needs to go in a vertical way and right now, or sorry, horizontal, and right now it's vertical. So what we need to do is we need to rotate this, and you can sort of hold shift and left click to drag these around and see which one is going to help you out because sometimes I get confused. Let's just zero this out, and you can see here that when we move Y, it's sort of like rotating it in this direction. And see how this is object here? So if you do have rotation elements on your object, you'll want to make sure, if I go into the properties here, you can see that everything is set to scale as 1 and rotation is set to 0. So make sure you Control A, apply your rotation before you do this to match exactly what I'm doing. We want to take this, and in order to get this to go basically horizontal here, all we need to do is change this to a 90 degrees. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to actually move the gradient. You can see it's way down here at the bottom, and we can actually move the gradient like this along the axes and pull it up to wherever we need it to be. And we can sort of adjust this as we need to, but let's just put it around here. And there's a pretty sharp contrast between here. If you wanted to sort of like ease this a little bit more, what you can actually do is take this scale and I can Control Shift and left click to drag this. And I'm just going to set this to a 0.05 because I already know what this value is that I want. And then we're going to pull this like this. And you can see there, I have a much more like the ease is a lot more gradual from the dark area to the lighter gray and the white section there. So that's going to be kind of based on how you want it to look. I'm going to sort of set this up in the same way that I've built it in my other project file, and then I'll show you how you can adjust this afterwards. From this point right here, we can actually add a converter color ramp, and we can pull the white over and pull the black over, and we can control the gradient again using these values, which is pretty cool. So basically from here, what we'll want to do is we will actually want to invert these colors. The white should be at the bottom and the black should be at the top because white means more rough and the condensation section should be rough. So we're going to flip these just like this, and you could add an invert node, which I think I did in my project file, but this will work pretty much exactly the same here. So we're just going to do something like this. And there we have our gradient map. And if we move around the object, you can see that there's that effect there. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to basically take this, and since I have a glass scratches already on this object, I want to use my new roughness map that I've created here using this gradient texture. I want to integrate that in with this stuff up here that I already have going into my roughness. So how we can do this is we can add a color, mix RGB, put it right between here. And what we want to do is we want to take this color and we want to put this in the bottom, just like this. And I'm going to view through this mix node. And you can see that we already have an effect going on here where they're mixed together. And what I want to do is I want to change this mix to a lighten. And if we move this to the left and move it to the right, you can see that that white color is being added as we change the factor. So color ramp down here that we have for the gradient texture is going up into this lighten color. And that is then going into the roughness. And if we look through that, now you can see we have a roughness that's happening just like that. So it's exactly what we expected. And from here, you can move this down or move it up, or you can take this value and move this around as much as you'd like. But basically, this is exactly what we're looking at doing with this project. But basically, this is exactly what we're looking at doing with our condensation as far as the roughness is concerned right down here. From here, you can kind of use this if you'd like and move on to the next part, but I actually found that when I did the render, the full render, I didn't quite like some of this effect here. It just felt like there wasn't quite enough sort of detail, and I'm kind of a detail-oriented person. So I added a little bit more variation to this condensation texture, and what I did was I added a texture, Voronoi texture like this. And what I did here, I'm just going to look through here, and I'm going to look through the color like this. And we're going to scale this up to 300. And you can see there's all these little tiny sections that are in here. And what I did was I took a new color. I basically duplicated this, changed this to multiply. Okay. And then we're going to take this color and put that in the top. And then we're going to take this color here and we're going to put that in the bottom. And let's look through there. And it looks kind of like this. And I took the factor and I moved it all the way up. And you can see that it creates this sort of multicolor effect here. Now, when we put this into the roughness, it's not going to actually look colorful. It's going to be more black and white. But if I take this and move it into the roughness, and let's take a look through here, you can see that it's added a little bit more versatility in where it kind of like breaks it up a little bit. Whereas before, if we take this and move this into here, it's sort of like overall rough, but there's really no detail, which can work. But I just noticed that in the final render, I didn't like it as much as this right here. So where it's kind of like broken up a little bit, and I felt like this looked pretty neat. And also, what I really like to do is I like to take this and put that into the bump. So now I have a bump map that has my scratches, but also the little bits of the condensation is sort of raised up a little bit, and there's some detail in there that looks really cool. So you don't have to do this part right here. You definitely want to do this here to add that roughness, but I thought adding this definitely had just a next level of looking really cool. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add the little water droplet particle field that goes around the object. So make sure that your file is saved. We're going to go into a solid mode here. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new object. And I'm just going to put it down below. It doesn't really matter where you put this. I'm going to add a metaball right here. And if we grab this on Z and move it down, you can see that it's this really weird looking thing. There's this ring around it, but if you duplicate it with Shift D and you move it, you can see it sort of connects to one another, kind of like a fluid particle. And we're going to make a particle field that uses this, and that's how we can have the water droplets look more realistic by having them duplicated, and if they're close enough next to each other, they kind of like form one shape like this. I'm going to delete that. And just really quick, you don't have to do this, but if I go into the Metaball information here, if you go over here on the Metaball panel, the object data properties here, you can see that you have these settings over here, 0.4 and 0.2, where it says resolution viewport and resolution render. Now, I will tell you that you might have some trouble if you have a very slow computer, because the more detail you put into this Metaball, it's going to be duplicated on here. Okay, so just keep that in mind when we do this next part, okay? So I'm going to take this resolution value and I'm just going to set the viewport to a 0.2, and that's just going to give it a little bit more of a detail as we put it as a particle field on our object. So let's select our object here, and I'm going to keep this viewer, this part of my view panel here like this, and I'm going to collapse these panels just so you can see it. And this is what I'm going to use as the workspace. So I'm just going to move this up here. And what we want to do is go to the particles right here, and we're going to click the plus button, and we're going to call this condensation. And this one here, we're just going to call this condensation as well. Now, what we want to have, let's go to wireframe mode. What we want to have is not an emitter, we want hair. And that's going to make a bunch of these here. So this is for hair particles, but we're going to use an object to project instead of these hair particles. And just for now, we're going to take the emission and we're going to put this down to like 500 or something, so it's not too many. And we're going to go ahead and we're just going to turn on the advanced setting right here, just in case we need it. And what we want to do is go down to the render section, and then where it says render as path, we're going to change this to object. And then the instance object, you'll want to use the pipette here or the eyedropper and select the metaball. And you can see on the left here, we have some new stuff going on that looks really funky. And you can see that it's now been created for our whole object here. Now, to make this a little bit easier to see, I'm going to turn off the water inside the glass, and I'm going to turn off the floor so that we can just look at the glass. And you can see that it's on the outside and on the inside and just kind of all over the place. So what we need to do here is we need to have this set to only have the sections that should have the water droplets on it. We want to make sure that the particle system only addresses that. So what we want to do is go into edit mode with tab, and you can see that I already have some loop cuts here. And if we turn on the water and turn on the wireframe, you can see that I've created a loop cut right up here at the very top, and there is a loop cut that goes down here. So what we want to do is we want to actually create what's called a vertex group. So if you go to the object data property, that's the vertex information right here. What we want to do is just select the areas that we want the water droplets to be connected to, or the condensation. So you can either use Shift Alt left click to select all of your loop cuts like this, and I'll just grab this bottom section right down here. Or you can select the section and hit Control plus and grab the sections you want. And I'm just going to grab this one up here. Now, one thing that I'll mention is that because we have a subdivision surface modifier on my glass object, there will be something that I'll show you, and that's kind of why I have this loop cut here. But I'm going to just select these sections here, and let's go to the vertex object data property, and right here we're going to click this plus, and it's going to add a group, and we're going to call this condensation. Make sure that you name all these. A lot of people and a lot of tutorials, they just hit plus and it's just called group. You want to make sure you name this, because sometimes you'll have a lot of vertex groups, and just make sure you name it. Click assign, and I just click it a couple times to make sure. I'm going to deselect everything and then just click select again just to make sure it's there, because sometimes even though I hit assign a couple times, it still doesn't do it. So there we have our vertex done, and let's go out of edit mode, go into our particle properties here, and then we're going to go down to the section that's called Vertex Groups. And in here, you can see there's a thing called density. And this will work for a lot of this stuff here. Basically, you can control how certain properties inside of your particles works based on this vertex group setting that we have here. But we're going to make this where density is controlled. And you can see that it goes all the way up really high, like to the top here. And that's because this top section was selected, and because it's subdivide surface modifier stuff going on, it's going way up there. So let's just remove that. So we selected this section here, make sure that I have the vertex group selected here, and we're going to remove that from the vertex group. And if I hit tab to go into object mode, you can see that now it's right there. Okay, so you can control that with this here. If I hit G twice, I can slide that around, or you can add a loop cut. Just be careful to not mess around too much with your geometry, just to make sure that those sections are being covered correctly. So let's go back into the particle settings. And these are pretty large. And we don't really want it to be that big. We want to go over to the render here. And you can see that there's a scale here, and we want to actually add randomness because water droplets aren't 100% the same. So let's take the scale randomness and put it up to a 1. You can see that they are changing size as I do that. And let's take the scale here and let's set this to a 0.01 or something like that. And you can see that now they're not visible. Okay. And if I change it to a 0.02, they're starting to become visible. And really what that is the scale of this object here. And the setting inside of here, set to a 0.2, that is what's making it to where we only see these weird looking triangles. So I'm going to set this to now a 0.01, and you can see that it took a lot longer. So don't do this if you're following along. But you can see that I put that as a 0.01 and already it kind of took a while, and I have a pretty powerful computer. So let's change this to a 0.05, okay? And you can see that that looks pretty good. But the scale is still too big, so I'm going to go back to the particle settings, change this to a 0.01, and that looks okay for now. And we can always adjust this as we need to. It's important to note that you can also take the object itself and scale this down, but sometimes that becomes a little bit weird. So I like to do it mostly on here, and if I can't go any lower, I just scale down the object. So make sure that you save a lot because sometimes you can lock up your computer if you make the scale too small, or if you change the metaball property here too much where your computer can't handle it. So just be careful and make sure that your render setting, it should at least be the same as your viewport or smaller, so that while you're just looking around, it'll be a not as detailed emission, but when it renders, it'll be a little bit more detailed. Looking at the particle emission, it looks really uniform. It just kind of goes perfectly across our object, and we really need a little bit more randomness going on here. So let's take a look, and if we go down into emission source, you can see there's even distribution, and then distribution here, it says jittered. So instead of that, let's change this to random. So you can see now it's much more randomized. And you can choose to have an even distribution or not, and you can choose to have a random order or not. That kind of just depends on what you want to do. And what we also want to do is use the modifier stack. And what that means is that it will take more into account anything that you have here, like subdivision surface modifiers or anything like that. And you can see that that's looking quite a bit better. It's more randomized, and we have some other stuff going on here. Now, what you could do, and I don't recommend doing this right now, but what you could do is you could add children to this and just watch what I do. Don't do exactly what I'm doing here. We can change this to interpolated, which will basically interpret where they are located, and then based on some values here and parting, clumping, roughness, and all this other stuff here, it will show a whole bunch of other stuff. You can get a little bit carried away with this, and sometimes this doesn't look as good as just adding some emission. In fact, in the final that I did, I found out that I chose not to use the children, so I turned those off. But you could try to use simple, you could try to use interpolated and mess around with those if you want. I actually encourage you to. But what I did for the final is I just took this value and I popped this up to, well, don't put this in, but I put this at 40,000, like this, okay? You can see that it's pretty crazy, all right? There's a lot of stuff going on. And I think that basically what I need to do here is take the scale and put this down even smaller. And then for this object here, I'm going to make this a 0.025 or something like that. And you can see there that it's looking a little bit more like what I want it to be. So smaller balls, kind of like that. So that's pretty much what mine ended up looking like in the final. Now, your computer might not be able to handle this, so make sure that you don't go too crazy too fast, sort of like increase it as you go. I would recommend that you first get the size of the particle and the quality down first, then add the number of emissions as you can, or the number of particles that are emitted as you can, and make sure that you save often while you're doing this. So we're going to call that kind of good for now, but it's not enough for us just to have that there. We need to have some kind of material for this. So let's go to the front view here and turn on rendered mode and just take a look. And you can see that it's just this white stuff that's on the surface here. And we're going to select the metaball, go to the shader editor here, and then over here on the left, I'm just going to turn off the overlays so we can just look at this as it is, just like that. And what we can do here is we can select the water, and you could potentially call this good. and that could be fine. But what I've noticed is that when I render this out, I'm just going to zoom in here. When I render this out, a lot of times the IOR setting, or the kind of like the visibility of the actual water droplets, is just too much. And I kind of don't like it. So what I do is I actually create a new material, and I call this either water droplets or condensation. Condensation here. And then I will take the IOR, and I'm actually going to remove this stuff here because it really doesn't need scratches on the on the water droplets. That doesn't really make any sense. So let's just delete these here. And I'm going to take the roughness, and I'm going to put it at a 0. And then I'm going to take the IOR, and I'm just going to set this to 1 to show you something. So if we zoom in here, you can see that it's basically almost invisible. There's some weird sort of like edge right here, but you can see that it's basically invisible. So an IOR of 1 is basically like air. And if we add a 1.1, that's adding some of that back in, and it's not as visible as if we had, let's say, a 1.33 or a 1.45 or whatever it is that you decide to do for your water. You can see how kind of like dark the edges are here. But like I said, I like to maybe set this to a 1.15, or just make this a little bit lighter so it's not as sort of like in your face. And it's just sort of like sitting there on the glass, and you can control the visibility by just adjusting some of these values in the IOR, just like that. So I'm going to turn on the ice here. I'm going to turn on the floor. And you can see that now we have a pretty good looking condensation that is, or the condensation effect that is going on with the glass here. And there's all sorts of ways that you can adjust this and change it with the particle field, with the roughness settings, and all of that stuff. That's going to be it for this tutorial. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you learned something. Again, if you want me to show you the whole how to create a glass and how to do all of those other materials and how to create the water and the ice cubes and all that stuff, make sure you leave a comment below. That's the best way I know how to sort of like gauge what you guys want me to do. Thanks so much again for watching, and thanks a lot to all of my patrons. You guys are awesome. If you want to become a patron, the link is down below. You can also join the Discord and chat on there if you have any questions, and I will see you all next time on DJ Tutorials.